Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a genuinely fascinating piece of source material from Mike Stagger over at Promethean Overviews. And look, regardless of where you sit politically, this is just an absolutely remarkable case study. We're going to look at how incredibly grand, sweeping geopolitical claims are made by wrapping current events in, well, ancient history and literal philosophy.
Okay, let's dive into this, because the creator kicks things off with a massive, striking central thesis. Donald Trump is remaking the entire Middle East in ways only comparable to Alexander the Great. Yeah, you heard that right. Stagger is directly comparing recent U.S. diplomacy to literally one of the most legendary, world-altering conquests in all of ancient human history.
Now, seeing a statement like that immediately begs the question, right? How exactly does a single argument connect ancient Greek conquests, modern Middle Eastern diplomacy, and, wait for it, Pythagorean geometry? I know, it sounds completely wild. It's this jarring, super eclectic mix of concepts that are entirely designed to reframe how we view global events.
So, to figure out how all this actually fits together, here's our roadmap for today. We'll hit the Alexander comparison, then reframing the Middle East, move into a new global coalition, touch on the geometry of politics, and finally wrap up with breaking conventional bounds. We're going to break these seemingly unrelated concepts down logically, I promise.
All right, let's start right at the top with Section 1, the Alexander comparison.
And this brilliantly illustrates a really strict binary worldview the creator sets up. You can see how heavily he relies on ancient history here. On one side, we have what he calls British imperialism and globalization. He frames this super intensely, describing it as a system of fear, a state of permanent war, even throwing in the biblical phrase, the Whore of Babylon. Then on the totally opposite side, we've got Alexander the Great and the American spirit. These are portrayed as the ultimate disruptors, forces meant to literally end empires and build cooperative, economic regions of trade.
Tracing this grand historical arc, he starts us way back in ancient times with Xenophon's March. That's where a relatively small Greek force faced down a massive Persian army, basically proving the giant actually could be beaten. Fast forward 2 generations later, and Alexander the Great takes up that exact mantle, conquering the region and radically reshaping civilization. But then, boom, the timeline jumps abruptly to the present day. The speaker argues that the whole imperial system Alexander fought against, well, it's now metastasized worldwide in the form of modern globalization.
Which brings us to Section 2, reframing the Middle East. Let's look at how this ancient history applies to modern diplomacy.
The creator points out this massive recruiting effort going on. We're talking Turkey, Egypt, the Gulf monarchies, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Pakistan. He argues that this huge coalition of Muslim powers, and remember, many of these nations have incredibly large armies like Egypt and Pakistan, are being strategically aligned to completely encircle Iran. He literally calls this diplomatic maneuvering a coup on the exact same scale as Alexander's ancient military strategies. So, the crucial point is how the speaker radically redefines the Abraham Accords. He argues that they aren't just about the diplomatic recognition of Israel in the Middle East. Far from it. He elevates them into a formal global rejection of the entire liberal empire of globalization itself. He sees this agreement as a renewed commitment to a system of totally sovereign, independent nations. In his view, it's essentially a grand global treaty meant to completely replace the current world order.
Moving right along to Section 3, a new global coalition. You might be wondering, if globalization is being dismantled, what exactly replaces it? Are the old European powers gone? Well, the source cites a purportedly leaked document that outlines 5 core nations meant to anchor this new global structure: the United States, Russia, China, India, and Japan. The speaker argues these great Eurasian and American powers are essentially stepping completely around traditional international bureaucracies to forge direct, sovereign alliances.
To reinforce this shifting world order, the speaker highlights a really interesting quote from a Pakistan opposition senator, Senator Khan. He stated, "At this moment, the world needs peace, and if we look at history, Yalta is the city of peace. Yalta is the place where peace spread from." The creator is using this direct reference to the 1945 Yalta Conference, where the post-WW2 order was literally drawn up, to argue that we are witnessing a modern equivalent right now, a totally new peace summit to decide the fate of our post-globalist world.
Okay, shifting gears entirely for Section 4, the geometry of politics. Get ready for some Pythagorean math.
Let's move to and see how this builds, because here the creator makes a totally unexpected, highly metaphorical pivot into a geometric puzzle. It goes like this. Step 1, you start with one square that has an area of exactly 1. Step 2, you add 3 more identical squares, creating a larger square with an area of 4. But step 3 is where the real challenge lies. You have to attempt to discover the exact length of a line needed to draw a square with an area of exactly 2.
Now, mathematically speaking, finding this requires the square root of 2, right? Which is an irrational number. But in the context of this explainer, it's not just a math term. It's a number that isn't simply counted using basic fractions. It literally has to be constructed entirely outside current limits. And the underlying takeaway he's pushing is that just like you can't solve this puzzle with standard fractions, you simply cannot solve today's geopolitical crises using conventional, limited political thinking.
And that leads perfectly into our final segment, Section 5, Breaking Conventional Bounds.
Tying all these historical epics and math puzzles together, the creator's ultimate call to action is loud and clear. You have to go outside the fence, and you have to leave the safety of groupthink. He insists that true political transformation, the kind of massive historical shifts he attributes to figures like Alexander the Great, only happens when society actually has the courage to step completely outside the artificially created boundaries and premises of modern liberalism.
This really reveals how he views two totally opposing intellectual forces. On one side, you have the enemy's tactic, a strategy he says limits public thought to short soundbites, cartoon narratives, and artificial flavors of freedom where people just compete for predefined ideas of success. But against this, he pits what he calls the American reflex. And this is characterized by big thinking, recognizing long historical arcs, and acting on an unbounded set of choices driven by faith rather than fear.
Which leaves us with a genuinely fascinating final question for you to ponder. How exactly does combining grand historical myths with abstract mathematics serve as a tool for modern political persuasion? Regardless of whether you agree with the source material's conclusions or not, analyzing its structure just reveals how creatively and ambitiously arguments are being built to shape worldviews today. By breaking it down, we can clearly see the mechanics behind the message. Thank you so much for joining this explainer, and remember to keep questioning how the information around you is constructed.